You think you know how a ruthless man operates. You think the violence hardens him, turns his chest into a vault no one can crack. Dominic thought the same. He ran a city with an iron fist, trusting absolutely no one. Then there was Linda, the quiet girl who scrubbed the blood out of his Persian rugs. When she started acting strange, he assumed betrayal. He followed her to catch a rat. Instead, he found a crumbling hospital, a devastating secret, and the one thing he never expected to lose: his own cold heart. Dominic did not believe in coincidences. In his line of work, a coincidence was just a well-planned assassination that hadn't pulled the trigger yet. He noticed everything: the slight tremor in a capo's hand when he lied, the exact angle of the security cameras in the warehouse, the way the ice melted in his bourbon when a conversation stretched too long. And lately he noticed Linda. Linda was a ghost in a house full of loud, violent men. She was 24, maybe 25, with mousy brown hair always tied back in a severe, practical knot. She wore the standard grey uniform of the estate's domestic staff. But on her, it hung loose, draped over a frame that seemed to be shrinking by the week. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't flinch when Dominic's men dragged a bleeding associate through the kitchen. She just waited for them to pass, grabbed the bleach, and got to work. She was perfect, invisible, until 3 weeks ago. It started with the broken glass. Dominic had been sitting in his study, going over the ledger from the docks. The room was heavy with the smell of old leather and the stale smoke of a Cuban cigar. Linda had come in to clear the coffee cups. She reached for the tray, her hand shaking so badly that a heavy crystal tumbler slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the hardwood floor. Dominic hadn't moved. He just slowly looked up. Most of the staff would have dropped to their knees, begging forgiveness, terrified of the man who ordered hits before his morning espresso. Linda didn't. She just stared at the broken glass for a long, agonizing moment. Her eyes were hollow, exhausted. When she finally looked at him, there was no fear, just a heavy, suffocating resignation. "I'll clean it up, Mr. Gallo," she had whispered. Her voice was raspy, like she hadn't used it in days. Since then, the anomalies piled up. She was arriving late. Her skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality. The dark circles under her eyes bruised purple. Twice he caught her lingering near the heavy mahogany doors of his office when he was taking meetings with his lieutenants. In Dominic's world, a sudden change in behavior meant one thing: someone was compromised. The feds were leaning on them, or a rival family had found a pressure point. Then came Tuesday afternoon. Dominic was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, watching the grey autumn rain lash against the glass. The city below looked like a smear of dirty charcoal. A quiet knock sounded at the door. "Come in." It was Linda. She didn't carry her cleaning caddy. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her knuckles were white. "Mr. Gallo, I need to ask a favor." Dominic turned around. He leaned against the windowsill, crossing his arms. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't offer comfort. "Speak." "I need an advance on my salary. 2 months, if possible. And I need to leave at 3 o'clock today." Dominic studied her. A rat usually didn't ask for money up front, but a desperate rat might. A rat trying to buy a bus ticket out of state before the heat came down. 2 months is a lot of money, Linda," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that usually made people sweat. "Are you in trouble?" "No, sir." She lied. He could hear the faint catch in her throat. "It's personal." "I don't do personal. I do business." He walked slowly toward his desk, keeping his eyes locked on hers. You want 2 months' pay. You want to leave early. In my world, people who want sudden cash and a quick exit are usually running from something or someone. I'm not running, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I have an obligation, please. I wouldn't ask if I had a choice. He pulled open the top drawer of his desk. He took out a thick stack of $100 bills bound in a rubber band. He tossed it onto the polished wood. It hit with a heavy thud. Take it, Linda exhaled a shaky breath. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she picked up the cash. Thank you, Mr. Gallo. I'll make up the hours, I swear it. See that you do. You're dismissed. She hurried out of the room, clutching the money to her chest like a shield. Dominic watched the door click shut. He stood perfectly still for 10 seconds. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out his keys, and bypassed his security chief entirely. If she was selling him out, he wanted to look her in the eye when he ended it. Dominic didn't take the armored SUV. He didn't take a driver. He went down to the subterranean garage and chose a nondescript black sedan. It was the kind of car that disappeared into city traffic, invisible to the untrained eye. He waited down the block from the estate's service entrance. At exactly 3:05 p.m., Linda emerged. She was out of her uniform, wearing a faded navy trench coat that looked completely inadequate for the biting November wind. She pulled the collar up around her neck and started walking fast. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't act like a woman checking for a tail. She just moved with a desperate, singular focus. Dominic put the car in gear and rolled slowly into the traffic, keeping 2 cars between them. She walked 6 blocks in the freezing rain to the subway station. Dominic cursed under his breath, parked the sedan in an illegal loading zone, and followed her down the concrete stairs into the humid, urine-scented subterranean tunnels. He kept his distance, blending into the crowd of tired commuters. He was a predator in his natural habitat, moving seamlessly through the shadows. Linda stood on the platform, staring blankly at the dark tunnel ahead. She clutched a worn canvas tote bag tightly against her side. The money was in there. Dominic knew it. He watched her hands. They were raw, the skin red and cracked from cheap soap and harsh chemicals. The train screeched into the station. She got on. Dominic slipped into the next car, watching her through the connecting windows. She didn't get off at the financial district, where the FBI field office was. She didn't get off in Little Italy, where the rival Moretti family held court. The train kept going, out of the affluent center of the city, out of the commercial zones. It rattled into the crumbling, neglected outer boroughs. The skyline outside the windows shifted from gleaming glass skyscrapers to decaying brick tenements and graffiti-scarred concrete. Finally, she stood up. The doors opened at a station in the deep south side. Dominic followed her up to the street level. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and cold. Puddles choked with trash reflected the flickering orange glow of the streetlights. This was a neighborhood the city forgot, a place where desperation baked into the pavement. Why was she here? A drop, paying off a debt to a local loan shark. If she was dealing with street-level scum, Dominic would have to kill them just on principle. No one on his payroll got squeezed by anyone but him. Linda walked another 3 blocks, her head down, dodging cracked pavement. She stopped in front of a massive, brutalist concrete structure. St. Jude's County General. It was a public hospital, underfunded and overwhelmed. The neon sign above the emergency room was missing 3 letters. Ambulances idled near the entrance, their red lights splashing across the wet pavement. Dominic frowned, a cold prickle of confusion settling at the base of his neck. A hospital. He watched as Linda pushed through the heavy glass doors. He waited 30 seconds, then followed. The lobby smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and human misery. It was packed. People slumped in plastic chairs, nursing broken arms, coughing into dirty rags, waiting for doctors who were hours behind schedule. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an angry electrical hum. Dominic scanned the room. He spotted her navy coat near the elevators. He didn't care about blending in anymore. He walked with the heavy, unyielding stride of a man who owned the ground he stepped on. People naturally moved out of his way. He watched the numbers above the elevator doors tick upward as Linda ascended. 4. She got off on the 4th floor. Dominic bypassed the crowded elevators and took the stairwell. He took the concrete steps 2 at a time, his breathing perfectly even, his mind racing. Was she dropping off a package, visiting an injured contact? He pushed open the heavy fire door to the 4th floor. The atmosphere here was different. The chaotic noise of the lobby vanished. It was eerily quiet. The walls were painted a sickening, cheerful pastel yellow, adorned with faded decals of cartoon animals. Pediatrics. Dominic froze. The heavy knot of paranoia in his chest unspooled, replaced by a strange, hollow sensation. He walked down the corridor. His custom leather shoes made no sound on the linoleum. He passed open doors. Inside, machines beeped rhythmically. Exhausted parents slept in uncomfortable plastic chairs. Small, fragile bodies lay buried under white sheets. At the end of the hall, near the nurse's station, he saw her. Room 412. Dominic stood in the shadow of a linen cart, completely still. The door to room 412 was slightly ajar. A narrow sliver of the room was visible. He didn't need to kick the door down. He didn't need his gun. The weapon in his holster suddenly felt absurd. A useless hunk of metal in a place where the real enemy was invisible and completely immune to bullets. He stepped closer to the gap in the door. Linda was sitting on the edge of a narrow hospital bed. Her trench coat was discarded on a chair. She was leaning over a child, a boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. The kid was devastatingly small. His head was completely bald, his skin the color of old parchment, crisscrossed with blue veins. A clear plastic tube ran beneath his nose, and an IV line vanished into the back of his bruised, tiny hand. Dominic watched. He didn't breathe. Linda wasn't crying. She was smiling. It was a radiant, heartbreaking smile that transformed her entirely. The invisible, beaten-down maid from his estate was gone. In her place was a woman glowing with a fierce, desperate kind of love. "Look what I brought, Keo," Linda whispered. Her voice carried through the crack in the door. It wasn't raspy anymore. It was soft, warm. She reached into her canvas tote bag. She didn't pull out the stack of $100 bills. She pulled out a small, battered comic book and a blue plastic action figure. The boy's eyes fluttered open. They were the exact same shade of brown as Linda's. He offered a weak, lopsided grin. "Captain Galaxy," the boy rasped, his voice barely louder than the hum of the heart monitor. "The one and only," Linda said. She placed the toy in his hand and pressed a kiss to his forehead. She lingered there, her eyes closing, absorbing the heat of his skin. "How are you feeling today, buddy?" "Tired. My bones hurt, Linda." "I know, baby, I know." She stroked his bald head. "The doctor says the new medicine is going to make you feel a little worse before you feel better. But you're tough, right? You're my tough guy. Tougher than Captain Galaxy." "Way tougher." Linda sat back. She reached into her bag again and pulled out the thick stack of bills Dominic had given her just an hour ago. She stared at it. The smile slipped from her face, replaced by a stark, terrifying exhaustion. She didn't look at the money with greed. She looked at it like it was a life preserver she had barely managed to catch. A nurse in blue scrubs stepped into the room carrying a clipboard. "Linda," the nurse said gently, "I'm glad you're here. Dr. Evans wanted me to speak with you about Keo's next round of treatment." "I have the money," Linda said instantly. She stood up, holding out the cash. Her hands were shaking again. "There's copay for the new trial, the outstanding balance for last month's bed fee. It's all here. Count it. Please just start the new cycle." The nurse looked at the thick stack of hundreds. She sighed, a sad, knowing sound. "Linda, honey, this covers the back debt. It gets you clear for what you owe us." "Right, so we can start the experimental trial." The nurse looked down at her clipboard. She couldn't meet Linda's eyes. "The pharmaceutical company pulled the subsidy for the trial this morning. The out-of-pocket cost just tripled. They need $80,000 to enroll him by Friday." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world ending. Dominic watched Linda's shoulders collapse. It wasn't a dramatic breakdown. It was worse. It was the physical manifestation of a spirit finally snapping under an unbearable weight. She dropped the money onto the small tray table. 80,000, Linda whispered. It sounded like a death sentence. I can't. I clean houses. I scrub floors. I don't have anything left to sell. I'm so sorry, Linda. We can keep him comfortable here. We can manage the pain." "No." Linda stepped forward, grabbing the nurse's arm. "No, you said this trial was his best shot. You said it could push the leukemia back. You can't just tell me to keep him comfortable. He's 7 years old." "Linda, please, my hands are tied." The nurse gently detached Linda's grip and stepped out of the room, leaving the door ajar behind her. Linda stood frozen in the middle of the room. She turned slowly back to the bed. Little Keo was asleep again, his breathing shallow. The action figure had slipped from his loose grip onto the blanket. Linda sank to her knees by the side of the bed. She pressed her face into the thin white mattress, and then she finally broke. The sobs were silent, violent tremors that shook her entire body. She buried her mouth in the blankets to keep the sound from waking the boy. Outside the door, Dominic felt a physical blow strike his chest. He was a man who ordered executions without blinking. He had watched empires burn and men bleed out on concrete floors. He had built his life on the cynical belief that everyone was greedy, everyone was corrupt, and everyone got what they deserved. But looking at this woman, the woman he had suspected of selling him out, the woman he had tracked through the rain with his hand, hovering over his gun, he felt a profound, sickening wave of shame. She wasn't stealing from him. She was bleeding herself dry to keep a child breathing. And she had swallowed her pride to beg a monster like him for a few scraps from his table. A few scraps that weren't even enough. Dominic looked at the stack of hundreds on the tray table. It was pocket change to him. A single bet at a card game. A bottle of vintage wine he would open on a Tuesday and forget to finish. To her, it was blood. He took a step back from the door. The cold, calculating mafia boss died in that corridor. Something else took over. A slow, terrifying warmth. A fierce, absolute conviction. He didn't walk into the room. He didn't offer her a shoulder to cry on. Dominic Gallo didn't know how to comfort people. He only knew how to fix things. With money, with power, and with absolute authority. He turned on his heel and walked away from room 412. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, dialing a number he reserved only for extreme emergencies. "Yeah, boss," a gruff voice answered on the first ring. "Get my accountant on the line," Dominic said, his voice echoing off the ugly yellow walls of the pediatric ward. His tone left no room for questions. "And find out who runs the board of directors for St. Jude's County General. I want to buy a hospital wing by tomorrow morning. Power moves in silence. It doesn't announce itself with a parade or a press conference. In Dominic Gallo's world, power was a phone call at 3 in the morning that made a grown man halfway across the city wake up in a cold sweat. Arthur Rossi, Dominic's chief financial officer, made that call. He didn't call the hospital's front desk. He didn't call the billing department. He called the private cell phone of the chief administrator for St. Jude's County General. By 4 a.m., the hospital board was engaged in a panicked, unauthorized emergency conference call. By 5:30 a.m., a wire transfer routed through 3 shell companies in Delaware hit the hospital's underfunded operating account. It wasn't $80,000. It was $2.5 million. Attached to the transfer was a single, heavily redacted legal directive. The pediatric oncology ward was now fully endowed by an anonymous trust. Every experimental trial was to be subsidized, and a specific patient, Leonardo, was to be bumped to the absolute top of the priority list for the new immunotherapy protocol. Failure to comply would result in the immediate withdrawal of funds and a devastating audit of the hospital's questionable vendor contracts. Dominic didn't sleep that night. He sat in the leather chair in his dark study, watching the rain turn to a fine, freezing mist over the city. He drank 2 glasses of bourbon. He felt a strange, tight sensation in his chest that had nothing to do with the alcohol. It was the complete loss of control. He had just diverted millions of dollars, broken his cardinal rule of absolute detachment, and exposed a financial artery, all for a woman who cleaned his toilets. He was losing his mind. That was the only logical explanation. At 7 a.m., the estate came alive. Dominic heard the heavy oak doors downstairs opening and closing. He heard the muffled voices of his security detail changing shifts. And then he heard the familiar rhythmic squeak of a cleaning cart moving down the second-floor hallway. Linda was here. Dominic stepped out of his study. He stood in the shadows of the landing, looking down the long corridor. She looked worse than yesterday. The absolute defeat in the hospital room had hollowed her out completely. Her skin was a terrifying ashen grey. She moved with mechanical slowness, spraying polish onto the mahogany wainscoting and wiping it down with a rag. She wasn't looking at the wood. She was staring through it. She looked like a woman who was simply waiting for her heart to realize it was supposed to stop beating. Dominic's jaw tightened. He wanted to walk down there. He wanted to grab her by the narrow shoulders, shake her, and tell her it was handled. He wanted to see the crushing weight lift off her neck, but he didn't. He couldn't. If she knew what he was, what he had done, it would terrify her. He was a monster who traded in blood and extortion. You didn't take miracles from monsters. There was always a price. Down the hall, Linda's cheap plastic cell phone vibrated violently against the wood of her cleaning cart. She flinched. She stared at it for a long time, terrified of the caller ID. When a hospital calls before 8 a.m., it is never good news. Her hand hovered over the device. Her fingers were trembling so badly she could barely swipe the screen to answer. "Hello?" Her voice was a fragile, papery whisper. Dominic stood perfectly still. He didn't breathe. "Yes, this is Linda." A pause. She leaned heavily against the wall, her knees buckling slightly. I know. I told the nurse yesterday. I don't have the money for the trial. I'm trying to figure something out. Please just give me a few days." She stopped talking. From 30 feet away, Dominic watched the exact moment the words registered in her brain. Her posture changed. The severe slump of her spine snapped straight. Her mouth fell open. "What?" she breathed. I don't understand. An error? What do you mean, an administrative error?" Another long pause. The person on the other end was talking fast. Fully funded, Linda repeated, the words sounding foreign on her tongue. The trial, the bed fee, everything. She dropped the rag. It hit the floor with a soft, wet slap. When does he start? She was crying now, not the silent, agonizing sobs from the hospital room. This was a frantic, desperate weeping, punctuated by sharp gasps for air. Today. Yes, yes, I consent. Do whatever you need to do. Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you. She hung up the phone. She didn't put it back on the cart. She slid down the mahogany wall until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as years of terror and exhaustion poured out of her in a flood of relief. Dominic watched her cry, the tight, uncomfortable knot in his chest finally unspooled. He didn't feel the cold cynicism that usually dictated his life. He felt something dangerously close to peace. He stepped back into the shadows of his study and closed the door without making a sound. The atmosphere in the Gallo estate shifted over the next 3 weeks. It wasn't something the men could pinpoint. The bourbon was the same. The cigars were the same. The weekly meetings detailing extortion rackets, union skimming, and territory disputes went off without a hitch. But the boss was different. Dominic was usually a coiled spring. He snapped at incompetence. He demanded silence in the hallways when he was working. Lately, however, a strange, quiet tolerance had settled over him. And then there was the new rule regarding the West Wing. Nobody walks on the carpets in the West Wing with street shoes, Dominic had announced calmly during a sit-down with his capos. And if you leave a mess in the kitchen after midnight, you clean it up yourself or you lose a finger. Carlo, a heavily scarred enforcer who had known Dominic for a decade, had stared at him in disbelief. You want us washing dishes, boss? I want you not acting like animals, Dominic replied, his voice flat and uncompromising. The staff is overworked. The staff was not overworked. There were 5 maids, 2 cooks, and a groundskeeper. But Dominic had noticed that Linda usually drew the short straw on the kitchen cleanup after the men had their late-night poker games. He wasn't going to let her scrub dried marinara sauce off plates at 2 in the morning when she needed to be at the hospital by dawn. Linda, for her part, was a completely different woman. The hollow ghost was gone. She still wore the shapeless grey uniform. She still kept her eyes downcast when the men were around. But the terminal exhaustion had vanished. There was colour in her cheeks. She moved with a brisk, determined energy. Sometimes, when she thought the house was empty, Dominic caught her humming. It was a quiet, off-key melody, a lullaby. It drove him absolutely crazy. He found himself manufacturing reasons to leave his office. He would walk down to the kitchen for a glass of water he didn't want, just to watch her wipe down the marble counters. He would stand on the balcony smoking a cigarette, tracking her movements as she crossed the courtyard to the laundry house. He was stalking his own maid. He knew it was pathetic. He didn't care. One Tuesday evening, the precarious balance in the house tipped. Dominic was in his study, going over a disputed shipping manifest. The door was open. Down the hall, he could hear the low murmur of voices. Carlo and another soldier, a young hothead named Dante, were arguing about a missed pickup at the docks. Linda walked past the open doors of the study, carrying a stack of fresh towels. "Hey, you!" Dante snapped. Dominic's head snapped up. He dropped his pen. "Get me a coffee. Black. And make it quick," Dante ordered, his voice dripping with the arrogant condescension of a man who carried a gun and thought it made him a god. Dominic stood up from his desk. His blood ran instantly cold. He moved toward the door, his hand instinctively brushing against the heavy steel of the pistol holstered at his waist. He was going to break Dante's jaw. He was going to throw the kid out the second-story window. But before Dominic could step into the hallway, Linda stopped. She didn't flinch. She didn't cower. The desperate woman from the hospital was gone. The woman standing in the hallway was a mother who had stared down a terminal diagnosis and won. A punk with a gun didn't register on her threat scale anymore. Linda turned slowly. She looked at Dante. Her brown eyes were completely dead, flat and unimpressed. "I am the domestic staff," Linda said. Her voice was quiet, but it possessed a razor-sharp edge that cut right through the masculine posturing in the room. "I do laundry. I clean floors. I do not run errands for associates who can't find the kitchen. The coffee machine is downstairs, second door on the left. Press the green button." Dante's face flushed a dark, ugly red. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Listen to me, you little—" "Dante!" The single word cracked through the hallway like a bullwhip. Everyone froze. Linda blinked, the sudden sharp noise breaking her focus. Dante spun around, the aggressive flush draining from his face instantly. Dominic stepped out of his office. He didn't yell, he didn't need to, he just looked at Dante. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Is there a problem with the coffee machine, Dante?" Dominic asked softly. "No, boss," Dante stammered, taking a quick step backward. Just asked a question." "She gave you the answer. Second door on the left, green button." Dominic's eyes were like black ice. "If you ever speak to the staff like that again, you won't need coffee. You'll need a liquid diet. Am I clear?" "Crystal, Mr. Gallo. Sorry, miss." Dante ducked his head and practically sprinted toward the stairs, Carlo trailing behind him with a low, nervous whistle. The hallway fell dead silent again. Linda stood holding the towels, staring at Dominic. Her chest was rising and falling a little faster than normal. She wasn't looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with intense, calculating curiosity. "Thank you, Mr. Gallo," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," Dominic said gruffly, irritated that he had blown his cover of indifference. He shoved his hands into his pockets. He was out of line, still. She shifted the towels in her arms. She didn't look away. "You've been very lenient lately, with the hours, with the kitchen rules. I run an efficient house. Exhausted staff make mistakes." "Right." The corner of her mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "Well, my son, he's doing much better. The new treatment is working. So, I won't be as exhausted." Dominic felt a sudden, massive kick in his chest. He kept his face entirely blank. "Glad to get back to work." He turned around and walked back into his study, shutting the heavy mahogany door firmly behind him. He leaned against the wood, closing his eyes. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. She was looking at him differently, and if he wasn't careful, he was going to burn his entire empire down just to keep that look on her face. It took exactly 2 months for Dominic's fragile restraint to shatter completely. The reports from St. Jude's were excellent. Rossi, acting as the intermediary for the anonymous trust, received weekly updates. Little Keo's white blood cell count was stabilizing. The tumors were shrinking. The kid was a fighter. Dominic should have been satisfied. The investment paid off. The transaction was complete. He should have closed the file and moved on to the Russian syndicate, trying to muscle in on his trucking routes. Instead, on a freezing late January afternoon, Dominic found himself parked 3 blocks away from St. Jude's County General. He didn't know why he was here. He told himself it was to ensure the hospital wasn't embezzling his money. He told himself he needed to verify the security of the ward. They were all lies. He was a man starving to death, and he just wanted to look at the fire through the window for a few minutes. He slipped into the hospital through a side entrance. bypassing the crowded lobby. He wore a dark wool overcoat, a charcoal suit, and a black scarf. He looked exactly like what he was, a wealthy, dangerous man who did not belong in a public health clinic. He took the stairs to the fourth floor. The pediatric ward was quieter today. The obnoxious pastel yellow walls still offended his sensibilities. He walked down the hall toward room 412. He intended to do exactly what he had done months ago. Stand in the shadows, look through the crack in the door, confirm the kid was alive, confirm Linda was smiling, and leave. But when he reached the room, the door was wide open. Dominic stopped. He looked inside. Linda wasn't there. The chair next to the bed was empty, though her familiar faded navy trench coat was draped over the back of it. On the bed, sitting upright and wrestling with a plastic tray of violently green jello, was Keo. He looked entirely different. He was still small, still painfully thin, but the translucent, deathly pallor was gone. His skin had color. A faint, fuzzy shadow of dark hair was beginning to grow back on his scalp. He wasn't hooked up to the terrifying array of machines anymore, just a single, standard IV line. Dominic should have walked away. The coast was clear. Retreat was the only tactical option. Instead, he took a step into the room. Keo paused his battle with the jello. He looked up. His large, dark brown eyes, Linda's eyes, locked onto the massive, imposing man standing in the doorway. Most adults found Dominic terrifying. He radiated violence. Keo just blinked. "Are you a doctor?" Dominic froze. His hand tightened on the doorframe. "No." "Are you the guy who comes to fix the TV?" Keo asked, pointing a plastic spoon at the small, square television mounted in the corner. "Because the cartoon channel is fuzzy." Dominic slowly let go of the doorframe. He took another step inside, drawn by a gravitational pull he couldn't fight. "I don't fix televisions." "Oh." Keo scooped up a chunk of jello and shoved it into his mouth. He chewed thoughtfully. "Then who are you?" Dominic stood at the foot of the bed. He looked down at the kid. He had negotiated with cartels. He had stared down federal prosecutors. But looking at this 7-year-old boy in a faded hospital gown, his mind went entirely blank. "I'm a friend of your mother's," Dominic said. The word tasted strange in his mouth. Friend. He didn't have friends. He had assets and liabilities. Keo's eyes widened. "You know my mum?" "Yes." "Do you work with her? At the big house with the scary guys?" Dominic felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. Scary guys. Linda had clearly painted a picture. "Something like that. I'm her boss." Keo dropped his spoon. The jello was forgotten. He looked at Dominic with sudden, intense scrutiny. He tilted his head, studying Dominic's expensive suit, the heavy gold watch on his wrist, the cold, hard lines of his face. "You're Mr. Gallo," Keo stated. It wasn't a question. Dominic's blood ran cold. "She talks about me?" "Sometimes." Keo leaned forward. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "She says you're very strict, and that you yell at people who wear shoes on the rug." Dominic let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "That's accurate." "She also says you're the reason we have the good insurance now," Keo said, his tone turning serious. "Because you gave her a raise." Dominic stared at the boy. The good insurance. A raise. It was the lie Linda had to tell herself, and her son, to make sense of the sudden influx of impossible money. She couldn't know it was a multi-million-dollar bribe. She just thought the hospital had made a mistake, and her boss had given her a few extra bucks to survive. "She works hard," Dominic said quietly. "She earned it." "I know." Keo looked down at his plastic tray. "She cries sometimes, but she thinks I'm asleep." I'm not supposed to know she's sad. He looked back up at Dominic, his dark eyes fiercely protective. You're not going to fire her, are you? Because she has to come here a lot? No, Dominic said. The word was a heavy, ironclad vow. I am never going to fire her. She can stay as long as she wants. Okay, good. Keo seemed satisfied. He picked up his spoon again. Do you like Captain Galaxy? I'm not familiar with the character. He's the best. He shoots lasers. Keo reached toward the nightstand to grab the blue plastic action figure. As he did, the IV line tugged sharply. The kid winced, dropping the toy. It clattered to the floor, rolling under the edge of the bed. Keo sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He tried to lean over the rail to get it, his small face grimacing in pain. Dominic moved before he thought about it. He stepped around the bed, dropping to one knee on the sterile linoleum floor. He didn't care about the custom tailoring of his slacks. He reached under the metal frame, his large, calloused hand wrapping around the cheap plastic toy. He stood up and handed it back to Keo. Thanks, Mr. Gallo. Keo smiled. Dominic, he corrected, surprising himself. Call me Dominic. Okay, thanks, Dominic. What are you doing? The voice came from the doorway. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream. But it hit Dominic with the force of a physical blow. He spun around. Linda was standing in the entrance to the room. She was holding 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. Her face was entirely drained of color. She was staring at Dominic with a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. She didn't see a boss. She didn't see a strict man who cared about carpets. She saw a ruthless mafia boss standing 3 feet away from her fragile, recovering son. She saw the violence he carried, the blood on his hands, invading the one safe space she had left in the world. Linda, Dominic started, taking a step toward her. Get away from him, she whispered. Her voice shook, but her eyes were wild, feral. She dropped the coffee cups. The hot brown liquid splashed across the linoleum, soaking into the pristine white floor. She didn't care. She crossed the room in 3 frantic strides, shoving herself between Dominic and the hospital bed. She put her arms out, shielding Keo from view. She was shaking violently, her chest heaving. Mom, Keo asked, his voice spiking with panic. Mom, what's wrong? He just got my toy. Hush, Keo, don't look at him, Linda commanded, never taking her eyes off Dominic. She looked at him like he was a loaded gun pointed at her child's head. What are you doing here, Mr. Gallo? Did I do something wrong? Did I take too much time off? I'll work double shifts. I'll clean the garage. Please, just don't be here. Dominic felt physically sick. He had killed men. He had ruined lives. He had never once felt guilty for any of it. But standing here, watching this woman throw her own frail body between him and a sick child, he hated himself. He hated what he was. He hated that his mere presence was enough to traumatize her. I'm not here to threaten you, Linda, Dominic said. He kept his voice low, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. He held his hands up, open, showing he wasn't reaching for a weapon. I was just in the neighborhood. I wanted to see how the boy was doing. You don't do neighborhoods like this, Linda snapped, her maternal instinct completely overriding her fear of him. And you don't care about sick kids. You're a businessman. You deal in debts. What do I owe you? Tell me what I owe you, and I'll pay it. You owe me nothing. People like you don't do anything for nothing, she cried out. Mom, stop it, Keo yelled from behind her, his small voice cracking. He's nice. He's the one who gave you the raise. The room went completely silent. Linda froze. The frantic, terrified energy drained out of her in a rush. She lowered her arms slowly. She turned her head, just slightly, to look at her son. "What did you say?" she whispered. "He's the boss you told me about," Keogh said, looking confused and frightened by his mother's reaction. "The one who gave you the money for the hospital." Linda turned slowly back to Dominic. The terror in her eyes was gone. In its place was a sharp, blinding intelligence, piecing together a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. She thought about the advance he gave her without a second thought. She thought about Dante being disciplined in the hallway for disrespecting her. She thought about the impossible, miraculous, administrative error that had funded a multi-million-dollar pediatric ward overnight, an administrative error, an anonymous trust. She looked at Dominic, really looked at him. She saw the tension in his shoulders. She saw the way his eyes, usually so cold and empty, were suddenly defensive, vulnerable. "The trust," Linda whispered, the words barely making it past her lips. "The anonymous donor." Dominic didn't say anything. He couldn't. "The hospital said, they said a private benefactor endowed the whole ward," Linda continued, taking a slow step toward him. $2.5 million. She stopped 3 feet away from him. She stared up into his face. "Was it you?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't terrified. It was broken wide open. "Did you do that?" Dominic looked at her. He could lie. He could intimidate her into silence. He could walk out the door and fire her tomorrow, erasing the complication entirely. He did none of those things. He looked into her brown eyes, stripped of all his armor, and told the first complete truth he had spoken in a decade. "Yes," the word hung in the sterile air. "Yes." Linda stared at him. The styrofoam coffee cups lay on the linoleum, a dark brown puddle slowly expanding toward the toes of Dominic's handmade Italian shoes. She didn't look at the mess. She didn't look at her son. She just looked at the man who ordered executions and subsidized pediatric oncology wings. "Why?" she breathed. Dominic didn't have a poetic answer. He didn't have a lie prepared. He was completely stripped of his usual defenses. "Because I had the money, and because he didn't deserve to die." Linda's chest hitched. A single tear broke free, tracking a hot line down her pale cheek. She reached behind her blindly, finding the doorframe for support. "Mom?" Keogh's voice was small, wavering with uncertainty. Linda snapped out of her shock. She turned back to the bed. She forced a smile onto her face, though it trembled violently. "It's okay, baby. Mommy just dropped her coffee. I'm going to step into the hall with Mr. Gallo for a second, okay? Eat your jello." She didn't wait for Keogh's answer. She grabbed Dominic's sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her knuckles white against the dark wool of his coat. She pulled him out of the room and pushed the heavy wooden door almost completely shut. The hallway was empty. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded deafening. Linda let go of his coat and took a step back, wrapping her arms around her own ribs. $2.5 million, she whispered, shaking her head. "Dominic, Mr. Gallo, I can't pay that back. Not in 3 lifetimes. Not if I scrubbed every floor in the city." "I didn't ask for a repayment plan, Linda." "Then what do you want?" she asked. There was a hard, cynical edge to her voice now. The world had taught her that every gift was a transaction, a trap. "Men like you don't drop millions of dollars out of charity. What is the catch? Do you want me to launder money? Do you want me to hold packages? What is it?" Dominic felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. It stung. It shouldn't have, but it did. She was entirely right to suspect him. He was a monster. But the idea of using her, of putting her in danger, made his stomach turn. He stepped closer, towering over her. He kept his hands firmly at his sides. "I want nothing. There is no catch. There is no package. The money is gone. It's an anonymous trust. I can't touch it, and neither can you. It exists solely to keep that kid breathing. Why? She demanded again, her voice cracking. I'm just the maid. You didn't even know my name 3 months ago. I knew your name, Dominic said softly. Linda froze. I noticed you, he continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. The truth was bleeding out of him, and he couldn't stop it. I noticed that you worked harder than anyone else in that house. I noticed that you looked like a ghost. I followed you here because I thought you were compromised. I thought you were selling me out to the feds or the Morettis. Linda let out a wet, incredulous laugh. You thought I was a rat. In my world, everyone is a rat eventually, Dominic said flatly. But then I saw you in that room. I heard the nurse tell you the price tag on his life. I saw you break. He paused. He looked away, down the long, ugly, yellow corridor. I ruin things for a living, Linda. I tear down. I break apart. For once in my miserable life, I wanted to fix something. He looked back at her. Her brown eyes were wide, swimming with unshed tears. I'm not asking for your gratitude, Dominic said, his tone turning cold, professional. He needed to put the armor back on before he did something stupid, like touch her. And I'm not asking for your fear. You keep your job. You keep your hours. You go back in there and you sit with your son. We never speak of this again. He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned on his heel and walked away. Linda stood in the hallway, watching the broad, dark line of his shoulders disappear into the stairwell. She didn't feel fear anymore. She felt an overwhelming, terrifying warmth. The devil had brought her a miracle, and she was starting to realize he wasn't the devil at all. 3 months later, the bitter winter thawed into a wet, grey spring. Keo was discharged. The experimental immunotherapy had ravaged his small body, but it had worked. The leukemia was in deep remission. He was still weak, requiring round-the-clock monitoring and daily medication, but he was home. Or, rather, he was at the estate. Dominic had moved them out of their crumbling outer borough apartment within a week of Keo's discharge. He claimed it was an issue of logistics. The estate had a vacant guest cottage near the Western Gardens. It was secure, it was quiet, and it meant Linda wouldn't be riding the subway for 2 hours a day. Linda hadn't argued. She was too tired and too grateful to fight him. The dynamic between them had shifted into a tense, unspoken truce. Linda still cleaned the main house. Dominic still ran his empire. But the heavy, invisible line separating the boss from the maid was blurring. Dominic found himself altering his schedule. He took his morning espresso on the back terrace, exactly at the time Linda walked Keo through the gardens for his daily sunshine. He would watch the kid chase butterflies, his bald head covered by a bright red baseball cap. Sometimes Keo would wave. Dominic would offer a stiff, barely perceptible nod in return. It was peaceful. It was domestic. It was incredibly dangerous. In Dominic's world, peace was just the deep breath you took before you started drowning. The problem came from the West Coast. A Russian syndicate, brutal and expansionist, had been trying to squeeze Dominic's supply lines for 6 months. Negotiations had failed. Warnings had been ignored. The Cold War had finally turned hot. It happened on a Tuesday. Linda had taken Keo to the hospital for his weekly blood draw. Dominic, paranoid about the escalating tensions, had strictly forbidden them from taking a cab. He had assigned his personal driver, a massive, silent man named Bruno, to take them in the armoured SUV. Dominic was in his study, pacing the Persian rug, waiting for the text that they were back inside the estate gates. His cell phone rang. It wasn't Bruno. It was Arthur Rossi, his financial officer. "Boss," Rossi said, his voice tight. "We have a problem. The Russians just hit the warehouse down by the docks. They burned it to the ground." Casualties are high. Dominic's blood turned to ice. Where is the hit squad now? Gone. But police scanners are reporting a shootout on the I-95 overpass. 2 black SUVs. The I-95 overpass. The exact route Bruno would take back from St. Jude's. Dominic didn't say a word. He hung up the phone, drew his heavy 1911 pistol from his desk drawer, and racked the slide. He didn't take the stairs. He didn't wait for his security detail. He sprinted through the main hall, out the heavy oak doors, and vaulted into the driver's seat of his reinforced sedan. The engine roared to life. He tore out of the estate gates, gravel flying, his mind a terrifying blank of absolute, murderous focus. He reached the overpass in 8 minutes. Traffic was completely stopped. Black smoke billowed into the grey spring sky. Dominic slammed on the brakes, abandoning the sedan in the middle of the highway. He sprinted through the gridlocked cars, his weapon drawn, ignoring the screams and honks of panicked civilians. Up ahead, he saw it. Bruno's armoured SUV was pinned against the concrete median. The hood was crumpled, hissing steam. The bulletproof glass was heavily spiderwebbed, peppered with assault rifle fire. 2 heavily armed men in tactical gear were advancing on the pinned vehicle. Dominic didn't yell. He didn't issue a warning. He raised his pistol and fired 3 times. The first 2 rounds took the trailing gunman in the spine. He dropped like a stone. The second gunman spun around, raising his rifle. Dominic didn't break stride. He fired again. The bullet caught the man in the throat. He collapsed against the concrete barrier, choking on his own blood. Dominic reached the SUV. The driver's side door was jammed shut. He looked through the shattered glass. Bruno was slumped over the steering wheel, bleeding heavily from a head wound, but he was breathing. Dominic wrenched the rear passenger door open. "Linda!" She was huddled on the floorboards, her body curled entirely over Keo. She was shielding him with her own flesh, just like she had at the hospital. At the sound of his voice, she snapped her head up. She was covered in broken glass. A jagged cut across her forehead was bleeding freely, the red blood stark against her pale skin. "Dominic!" she choked out. He reached in, grabbing her by the arms and hauling her out of the vehicle. He dragged Keo out next, holding the terrified boy against his chest. "Are you hit? Are you shot?" Dominic demanded, his hands frantically checking Linda's arms, her back, her neck. No, it's just glass. Keo is fine. He's fine," she babbled, her hands shaking as she grabbed Dominic's lapels. "They came out of nowhere. They just started shooting." "I know. I've got you." More sirens wailed in the distance. The police were coming. Dominic couldn't be here when they arrived, not with 2 dead bodies on the asphalt. He looked at Bruno. The driver was stirring, groaning in pain. "Bruno! Keys!" Bruno fumbled in his pocket and tossed Dominic a spare fob for a safe house vehicle parked 3 blocks away. Dominic grabbed Linda's hand. His grip was iron-clad. "We have to move, now." They ran. They left the wreckage, the smoke, and the dead men behind. Dominic kept himself positioned between Linda and the open road, a human shield ready to catch a bullet. He didn't feel the adrenaline. He just felt a cold, absolute certainty. He would burn the entire city to the ground before he let anyone touch them. The safe house was a high-rise penthouse in the financial district, registered under a shell corporation. It was sterile, cold, and entirely secure. Dominic locked the heavy steel door behind them. He set the alarm system. Only then did he let go of his gun. He placed it on the marble kitchen island. Keo was sitting on the modern leather sofa, clutching his Captain Galaxy figure. He wasn't crying. He was in shock. Linda rushed to the bathroom and came back with a warm, wet towel. She knelt in front of her son, gently wiping the dust and tiny shards of glass from his face. "It's okay, baby. We're safe. Dominic got us out. We're safe." Dominic stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city skyline. His back was to them. He felt a deep, agonizing ache in his left side. The adrenaline was fading. He looked down at his grey suit jacket. The fabric was torn just below the ribs. It was soaked in dark, thick blood. A ricochet from the rifle fire. He hadn't even felt it. He shrugged off the jacket, letting it drop to the floor. The white dress shirt underneath was ruined. Linda stood up. She saw the blood. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You're hit." "It's a graze," Dominic said gruffly. He unbuttoned his shirt with slightly trembling fingers. "Just took some meat. I've had worse." "Sit down," Linda ordered. It wasn't a request. It was the tone of a woman who had spent the last year fighting a war in hospital rooms. Dominic looked at her. He didn't argue. He walked over to a heavy wooden dining chair and sat down. Linda went to the kitchen and found the emergency first aid kit stashed in the pantry. She brought it to the table. She didn't hesitate. She pushed his ruined shirt off his shoulders. Dominic was heavily scarred. Knife wounds from his youth. A bullet scar on his shoulder. Tattoos denoting allegiances he had long outgrown. Linda didn't flinch. She cleaned the jagged, bleeding gouge on his ribs with antiseptic. Dominic hissed, his jaw clenching tight. "Sorry," she whispered. Her fingers brushed against his skin. They were warm, soft. It was a terrifying contrast to the violence of the day. "You shouldn't be doing this," Dominic said, his voice low. He kept his eyes fixed on the wall behind her. "I have doctors for this." "Your doctors aren't here." She began wrapping a heavy gauze bandage around his torso. To do it, she had to lean in close. Her face was inches from his chest. He could smell her shampoo, something cheap and floral, like lavender. He could feel the rapid, uneven beat of her heart against him. "I'm sending you away," Dominic said abruptly. The words felt like broken glass in his throat, but he forced them out. Linda stopped wrapping the bandage. She looked up at him. "What?" "I'm transferring 10 million into an offshore account in your name. I've already arranged for a private jet. You and Keo are going to Switzerland. The medical care there is the best in the world. You'll be safe. You'll never have to clean another floor, and you'll never have to look over your shoulder." Linda stared at him. "You're sending me away." "I'm a dead man walking, Linda," Dominic said, finally meeting her eyes. His gaze was fierce, desperate. "The people who shot at you today? That was a message for me. My world is completely poisoned. Everything I touch turns to ash. I thought I could keep you safe on the estate. I was arrogant. I was wrong. I almost got your son killed today." "You saved my son today," she corrected fiercely. "I brought the bullets to him." Dominic raised his voice, a raw, jagged sound tearing from his chest. "Look at me, Linda. Look at what I am. I killed 2 men today without blinking. I'm going to spend the next week hunting down the rest of that syndicate, and I'm going to butcher them. That is my reality. You do not belong in it. You are good. You are clean. I won't let my filth drag you down." Linda finished tying off the bandage. She didn't step back. She stayed exactly where she was, standing between his knees, her hands resting lightly on his bare chest. "I've been clean my whole life," Linda whispered, looking deep into his eyes. "Being clean got me a crumbling apartment and a son dying in a public ward because I couldn't afford the luxury of keeping him alive." She stepped closer. The cynical, beaten-down Maid was entirely gone. "I don't want clean anymore, Dominic. Clean didn't save my boy. You did." She reached up, tracing the hard line of his jaw. "You think you're a monster. Let me tell you something about monsters. They don't buy pediatric wards for strangers. They don't take a bullet shielding a kid who isn't theirs. Dominic's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a starving man. "Linda, please, if they hurt you." "They won't," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, quiet certainty. "Because you won't let them." She didn't wait for him to argue. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was desperate. It was rough. It tasted of adrenaline, copper blood, and absolute survival. Dominic groaned, a deep, surrendered sound. His massive hands came up, wrapping around her waist, pulling her fiercely against his chest. He held her like she was the only anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. He had spent his entire life building walls. He had acquired wealth, power, and fear to ensure no one could ever touch him. And it only took a quiet woman with a mop to completely dismantle his empire. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Dominic rested his forehead against hers. The silence in the penthouse was thick, but it wasn't lonely anymore. "Switzerland is cold," Linda whispered against his lips. "I think I'd rather stay here, with you." Dominic let out a shaky breath, a smile finally cracking the hard, ruthless lines of his face. He pulled her tighter. "Okay," he murmured. "You stay." He opened his eyes, looking past her shoulder to the living room. Keo had fallen asleep on the leather sofa, the blue plastic action figure tucked safely under his arm. Dominic Gallo was still a ruthless man. He still ran a city with an iron fist. But as he held the woman who had cracked the vault of his chest wide open, he knew one thing for certain. He finally had a reason to fight. That's the reality of Dominic and Linda's story. Sometimes the greatest miracles come from the darkest places. Did you expect Dominic to risk his entire empire for his maid? Let me know your favorite moment down in the comments. If this gritty, emotional ride kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves a real redemption arc. Don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.